Welcome to Whispers in the Dark. Settle in. Turn the lights down if you can. Put your headphones on. Let the hush between sentences stretch a little longer than you expect. And if you are listening late, when the house is finally still, do not look too long at the corners of your room. The mind loves to put shapes there, or perhaps shapes love to find the mind. Now let's begin. What if the happily ever after was just a cover-up? What we find in the cottage will send shivers down your spine. This is not the Goldilocks story you were told. This is the true version, the older one, the one people tried to sand smooth with pretty curls and a child's face, because the original ending tasted like fear. Tonight you are stepping into the quietest part of the woods, where the trees stand so close they seem to whisper to one another, and where smoke rises from a chimney that should have meant warmth, not warning. The forest was the kind that did not feel like a place people belonged. The canopy stitched itself together overhead, dark leaves overlapping like scales, and the light that fell through came down in thin, sickly ribbons. Moss softened the roots, and ferns crowded the path, and everything smelled of damp earth and old bark, and something faintly sweet, like fruit that had begun to rot before anyone thought to pick it. Far from villages, far from roads, there stood a little house, neat as a kept secret. It was built of wood that had aged into a deep brown, and its roof wore a soft pelt of lichen. Smoke rose from its chimney in a thread so steady it looked practiced. The window panes were clean. The door was shut. The latch was simple. The kind of place a passerby might think of as safe, a little refuge, a warm spot for a traveler who had lost their way. But there are cottages in the world that look inviting, because they have learned that is what brings trouble to their threshold. Inside lived 3 bears, and in the oldest telling, they were not a family in the way people later liked to imagine. They were 3 bears who kept a house together. 3 bears with 3 different sizes of voice, 3 different weights of step. They had fashioned their lives like a triangle, each point holding the others in place. They had beds in the upper rooms, and chairs set before their hearth, and a table that sat steady in the center of the kitchen. They had their own bowls for porridge, set out with a care that suggested a ritual, not merely a meal. The great huge bear was the largest, broad-shouldered and heavy, his fur dark and thick, his breath steady as bellows. When he moved, the floorboards complained. His presence filled space even when he was still. There was a patience to him that could be mistaken for gentleness, the way a mountain seems calm until it decides to move. The middle-sized bear was not small, not truly, but next to the great huge one he seemed quicker, sharper, his muzzle narrower, his eyes more watchful. He was the sort that listened first and spoke last, and when he did speak, it was with a tone that suggested he knew more than he was saying. And the little small wee bear was the smallest of the 3, though still a bear, still strong, still capable. His fur had a lighter cast, and his movements were restless, as if he carried a nervous energy that could not settle. He had a voice that could climb into a high, keen sound when he was upset. And it was that voice, in the old story, that people remembered. Not because it was cute, as later versions insisted, but because there is something unsettling about a small voice that can cry out like a child in a house where there are no children. That morning, they made their porridge. The kitchen was warm with the work of it. A pot sat over the fire, and the smell of oats and milk rose thick in the air, mingling with the sharp scent of wood smoke. The great huge bear stirred with a slow, steady motion, each turn of the spoon like the passing of time. The middle-sized bear measured and tasted, adjusting as if the exactness mattered. The little small wee bear bounced on his paws, eager, impatient, his hunger making him huff. When the porridge was ready, they poured it into 3 bowls, one great and deep, one middle-sized, one little and neat. They set them on the table, and steam curled upward like ghosts lifting their heads. But the porridge was too hot. They could have eaten anyway. Bears do not always wait. Yet they did, as if waiting was part of what made this house their house. They decided to take a walk in the woods while the porridge cooled. They stepped out together, the door clicking shut behind them. The latch fell into place. The cottage settled into stillness, the only movement the slow drift of steam from the bowls and the quiet poolsing of heat from the hearth. Outside, the forest watched. Not long after the bears had gone, something else moved between the trees. She was not a golden-haired child skipping along a path. The earliest version did not bother with the sweetness people later insisted on. It was an old woman, and the word old in those days did not mean kindly grandmother. It meant weathered. It meant hard edges. It meant a face that had learned to look past other people's comfort. She came through the undergrowth like a thought you do not want to have, the kind that arrives uninvited and stays. Her back was bent, but whether from age or habit was hard to say. Her clothes hung in layers, patched and dark. Her hands were thin, the knuckles pronounced, the nails rimmed with dirt. Her eyes were bright in her face, bright in a way that did not feel lively, but hungry. She had been wandering. That part is true. She had come from somewhere and was going somewhere else, but the woods had swallowed the sense of direction. Her stomach had been aching for a long time, and she had begun to mutter to herself about food and warmth, and the unfairness of a world that forgot people once they were no longer pretty. Then she saw the cottage. Smoke, she thought. Someone is home. Someone has food. Someone has something I can take. She approached the door and lifted her hand to knock. The sound in that forest was strange. Even a knock seemed loud, as if it carried. She rapped once, then again. The door did not open. There was no voice from within, no footsteps. She tried the latch. It gave. In most stories, that is where people start saying careless things about curiosity. But this was not curiosity. This was a choice. The door swung inward with a soft groan, and warmth rolled out like a living thing. The The old woman stepped inside. The cottage smelled of porridge and smoke and fur. The air was thick and comforting in a way that felt almost wrong after the chill of the woods. She stood for a moment just inside the doorway, letting the heat seep into her skin. Her eyes moved quickly, taking inventory. Table, chairs, hearth, stairs, everything tidy, everything owned. And on the table, 3 bowls of porridge. Steam still rose from them. The old woman's mouth tightened. She had the look of someone who believed the world owed her whatever she could reach. She went to the bowl belonging to the great huge bear first. In the old telling, she tasted each, and we must keep that truth. She leaned over the great bowl and put her spoon in. The porridge clung thick and heavy to the metal. She lifted it to her mouth and ate. Her face pinched. "Too hot," she said aloud, as if the porridge had offended her personally. She moved to the bowl of the middle-sized bear. Another spoonful, another taste. Her breath hissed between her teeth. Still too hot. She turned to the little small wee bear's bowl. By the time her spoon dipped into it, the steam had thinned. The surface had begun to settle. She ate. This one was neither too hot nor too cold, she said, and there was satisfaction in her voice. The satisfaction of someone who has found the exact point where taking becomes easy. She sat at the table and began to eat, not with restraint, not with gratitude, but with the quick, efficient motions of someone who expects to finish before anyone returns. Spoon after spoon. The small bowl emptied. She ate it all, not a polite portion, all of it. When the last scrape sounded against the bottom of the bowl, she looked up, and her gaze drifted to the chairs by the hearth. There were 3 chairs, just as there had been 3 bowls. One great and solid, one middle-sized, one little and neat. The chairs were arranged as if waiting for their owners to sit. The old woman's feet dragged across the floor as she approached the great, huge bear's chair. She lowered herself into it. The chair creaked under her weight, and she shifted, grimacing. Too hard, she complained, as if the chair were built for her comfort and had failed. She moved to the middle-sized bear's chair and sat. Too soft. Then she turned to the little small wee bear's chair and sat. This one was just right, she said, and she leaned back, settling in, letting her spine rest. For a moment, she looked almost content, like a thief who has decided she belongs in the place she is stealing from. Then there was a crack. It did not sound like a polite snap. It sounded like a bone. The little chair broke beneath her. She jolted forward, hands flailing, and hit the floor with a thud that made the hanging pans tremble. For a moment she lay there, stunned, her breath knocked out of her. Then she pushed herself up, face flushed with anger and embarrassment. She looked at the broken chair as if it had attacked her, as if she were the victim. She gathered herself and began to wander again, deeper into the cottage. The stairs creaked as she climbed. The air grew cooler upstairs. The warmth from the hearth, fading into a more private stillness. The hallway was narrow. 3 doors, 3 beds. The old woman tried the first door and stepped into the room of the great huge bear. The bed filled most of the space, big as a raft. The blankets were thick. The pillow was large. She climbed onto it with difficulty and lay down. Almost immediately, her face twisted. Too high at the head, she muttered, shifting. Or perhaps too heavy. Or perhaps she was simply not the sort of person who could be comfortable anywhere she had not ruined. She went to the next room, the bed of the middle-sized bear. She lay down. Too low at the head, she said, and she slid off with a sniff. Then she went into the room of the little small wee bear. The bed was smaller, but it was made with care. The coverlet lay smooth. The pillow was plump. There was something about it that suggested the bear who slept there cared about comfort, because he knew what it felt like to be uneasy. The old woman climbed in. "This one is just right," she whispered, and her eyes half closed. She fell asleep. Not a light doze, but a deep, careless sleep, the kind that comes when someone has taken what they wanted and believes they have gotten away with it. Her breathing slowed. Her mouth fell open slightly. The cottage held her like a secret. Outside, the forest changed its mind about being quiet. The bears returned. They came back the way they had gone, not rushing, not alarmed. The walk had been ordinary. The birds had called. The wind had moved the branches. Nothing had warned them that a stranger had crossed their threshold. But when they reached the cottage, something was wrong. The door was not as it should be. It was closed, yes, but the latch did not sit with the same certainty. The great huge bear's nostrils flared. The middle-sized bear paused, head tilting slightly as if listening. The little small wee bear's ears twitched, and he stepped closer. The great huge bear pushed the door open. Warmth spilled out. So did a scent that did not belong. Human, a sharp thread of it, sweat and old fabric, and the sour tang of someone who had walked too long without washing. The bears entered, and the room greeted them with the normal things it held: table, chairs, hearth. But the normal had been disturbed. A spoon lay wrong. A bowl sat with its surface broken. The great huge bear went to the table first. He looked into his bowl. "Someone has been at my porridge," he said, and his voice was like a low thunder far away. The middle-sized bear looked into his bowl. "Someone has been at my porridge," he said, quieter, but edged. The little small wee bear stepped forward and peered into his small bowl. "Someone has been at my porridge," he cried, and his voice was high and sharp, and it cut through the cottage like a blade. And then he cried again, because his bowl was empty, and they could smell her. Now that they were inside, the scent was everywhere. Not just on the air, but on the wood, on the cloth, on the very idea of the place. It was as if she had left fingerprints made of smell. They turned to the chairs. The The great huge bear looked at his chair. "Someone has been sitting in my chair," he said. The middle-sized bear looked at his chair. "Someone has been sitting in my chair," he said. The little small wee bear rushed to his chair, and his cry rose again, desperate. "Someone has been sitting in my chair and has broken it all to pieces." This part is still in the old story, and it has always been the moment when children laugh. The broken chair, the silliness of it. But in a quiet house, with 3 bears standing over the evidence of an intruder, the broken chair is not funny. It is proof that someone entered without fear. Proof that someone took and spoiled and stayed long enough to sleep. The bears did not speak for a moment. They simply listened to the cottage, as if the walls might tell them where the wrongness had gone. Then the middle-sized bear moved toward the stairs. "Upstairs," he said, though he did not need to. The scent was stronger there. They climbed, their steps heavy, each creak of the stairs like a warning bell. The hallway upstairs was cooler. The air holding the faint, stale sweetness of porridge and the stronger sourness of the intruder. The great huge bear opened his door first and looked at his bed. "Someone has been lying in my bed," he said, and his voice held a slow, controlled anger. The middle-sized bear opened his door and looked at his bed. "Someone has been lying in my bed," he said, and the words sounded less like surprise and more like confirmation. The little small wee bear pushed into his room and stared at his bed. "Someone has been lying in my bed, and here she is." In the original, that is when she woke and fled. That is when she jumped up, screamed, and ran. That is the escape. That is the neat little ending. The old woman tumbling out the window and vanishing into the woods, never to be seen again. But tonight, we are not telling the softened version people repeated to their children until the edges wore off. Tonight we ask what really happened when the predator met the prey. The old woman lay in the little bed, mouth open, eyes closed, her face slack with sleep. She did not wake at first, not even when the little small wee bear's voice sliced the air. Her body was heavy with stolen comfort. The great huge bear stepped closer, and the floorboard beneath his paw groaned. That sound, deep and slow, finally stirred her. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a heartbeat, there was the blank confusion of waking. The ceiling, the unfamiliar smell of fur and smoke, the sense of being somewhere she should not be. Then she turned her head. She saw them, 3 bears in the doorway and beside the bed, their bodies filling the room, their eyes fixed on her with a focus that did not waver. Her mouth opened, and she made a noise that was half gasp, half attempt at a scream. She scrambled upright, blankets tangling around her legs. "No," she croaked, and the words sounded ridiculous in the face of what she had done. "No, no, do not." She lunged toward the window, because that is what the old story says she did. She reached for the latch with shaking hands, but the middle-sized bear was quicker than a human expects something that size to be. He moved, and his paw came down not as a swipe, not as a theatrical attack, but as a firm barrier. The old woman froze. Her breath came fast. Her eyes darted, searching for the simple way out of the old tales, as promised. The great huge bear did not roar. He did not need to. He simply stood and let his silence press down. "You came into our house," the middle-sized bear said, and his voice was calm in a way that felt worse than rage. "You tasted, you judged, you took." The old woman's eyes flicked to the little small wee bear, perhaps hoping the smallest would be the easiest to trick, the easiest to frighten. But the little small wee bear's gaze was fixed and shining, not innocent, not playful. There was something in his expression that suggested hurt had curdled into a colder thing. "My porridge," he said, and his voice trembled. "My chair." The old woman swallowed. Her throat worked like something trying to force down panic. "I was hungry," she said. "I was cold. The door was not locked." The great huge bear's head tilted slightly, as if considering her. Then he stepped forward, and the room seemed to shrink. "The door was shut," he said, and the simple statement carried the weight of law. A shut door means no. The old woman's mind snapped into a desperate kind of cleverness. She backed toward the bed again, hands up, palms out. She tried to smile, as if she could wrap the moment in charm. "Surely we can settle this," she said. "Surely you do not mean to harm an old woman." The middle-sized bear's eyes narrowed. "Old does not mean harmless," he said. And then, because the oldest stories were not written to protect you from consequences, the bears did what bears do when something enters their den. They took control of the room, not with a frenzy, not with a spray of horrors described in detail, but with an inevitability that was worse. The old woman fought, of course she did. She clawed at the air. She kicked. She tried to bite. She tried to slip past them. She screamed promises and threats and prayers in the same breath. But she was an intruder in a bear's home, and the forest does not grant mercy just because someone is human. The great huge bear gripped her with a strength that made her struggle look like a child's tantrum. The middle-sized bear held her arms. The little small wee bear, trembling with a kind of righteous fury, took the blanket from his bed and wrapped it around her like a binding. They carried her downstairs. The cottage below was still warm. The hearth still glowed. The table still sat at the center of the room, with the empty bowl that had started this. The old woman's feet scraped the floor, leaving faint marks. She tried to twist free. She begged now, voice hoarse, eyes wide. She promised she would never return. She promised she would tell no one. She promised anything a person promises when they realize the world has turned its face toward consequence. The bears did not answer with words. In that moment, the cottage felt like a place that had been waiting for this. The chairs were witnesses. The table was an altar. The bowls were waiting mouths. The great huge bear went to the hearth. He lifted the pot from where it had been set aside. The porridge inside had cooled, thickened, become heavier. He placed it back over the fire. The old woman's eyes locked on the pot. "No," she whispered, and this time it was not a command. It was a plea. The middle-sized bear moved around the kitchen with quiet purpose. He gathered what was needed: water, oats, a pinch of salt. He did not rush. He did not fumble. It felt practiced, and that was the worst part. The little small wee bear dragged his broken chair closer to the fire and stared at it as if it were a grievance made visible. He looked at the old woman. His small voice rose again. "Just right," he said, repeating her words back to her. "Just right." And then, because the old tale had always been about trespass and consequence, because a house is not a toy box for strangers, because some versions of a story exist to warn rather than to comfort, the bears made their ending. They did not simply chase her away into the woods, where she might stagger into another home and test another latch. They did not let her become a rumor. They did not allow her to carry the lesson out of the cottage and choose to ignore it. Instead, they made her part of the ritual she had violated. The great huge bear's voice rumbled low as he spoke, not to her, but as if to the cottage itself. "You wanted our porridge," he said. "You wanted our seat. You wanted our bed. You wanted what was ours, and you wanted it without asking." The middle-sized bear looked at her with a steady gaze. "Then you will give back," he said. The old woman shook her head, so hard her neck strained. Tears ran down the lines of her face, carving clean paths in the grime. "Please," she said, "please, I did not mean." But meaning is not what decides the forest's justice. What happened next is told in whispers for a reason. The bears worked with grim certainty, and the old woman's cries were swallowed by the thick walls and the deep surrounding woods. The fire popped and sighed. The pot began to steam again. The smell of porridge grew stronger, richer, heavier, as if the air itself was being thickened into something you could choke on. When it was done, the kitchen was quiet again, in the way a room becomes quiet after a storm has passed through. 3 bowls sat on the table, one great and deep, one middle-sized, one little and neat. The porridge in them was darker than before. Not by much, just enough that if you did not know, you might assume it was a different grain, a different milk, a different kind of sweetener. The steam rose in slow curls, and in the steam you could almost imagine shapes, almost imagine a face that had once been sharp with hunger and entitlement. The bears sat in their places, the great huge bear at his chair, the middle-sized bear at his, the little small wee bear standing beside the broken pieces of his, because his chair could not hold him now, and perhaps that too was part of the point. They ate, not with delight, not with gloating laughter. They ate the way creatures eat when they have restored a balance they believe was broken, spoonful by spoonful, and as the bowls emptied, The cottage seemed to breathe easier, as if something that did not belong there had finally been absorbed, finally been erased. When it was over, the great huge bear set his spoon down and stared into the empty curve of his bowl. The middle-sized bear wiped his mouth with the back of his paw and looked toward the door. The little small wee bear stared at the last smear at the bottom of his bowl, then lifted it, turned it, and licked it clean, as if making absolutely sure there was nothing left. Outside, the forest did not change. It simply continued being a place that hides what happens within it. By morning, if anyone had wandered past, they might have seen the same neat little cottage. They might have smelled smoke. They might have thought of warmth and safety. They might have knocked and found no answer. They might have tried the latch and found it set firm. They would not have seen the broken chair because it had been replaced. They would not have smelled anything but porridge and wood smoke. They would not have known that the true story did not end with a frightened old woman fleeing into the trees. And that is how a cover-up works. Not by inventing a lie from scratch, but by swapping one detail that changes everything. They say it was a little girl, because a little girl feels safer than an old woman with hard eyes. They say she ran away, because that is easier for the listener. They say the bears were a family, because families feel like something you can trust. They say she learned a lesson, because lessons are supposed to be clean. But if you listen closely to the oldest telling, you can still hear what they tried to bury. 3 bears who kept a house together. 3 bowls of porridge too hot to eat at first. A walk in the woods. A human who entered uninvited. The tasting. The judging. The taking. The broken chair. The sleeping in the smallest bed. The discovery. The words spoken in 3 sizes of voice. Someone has been at my porridge. Someone has been sitting in my chair. Someone has been lying in my bed. And here she is. If you ever find yourself walking through woods that feel too quiet, if you ever see a little house with smoke curling from its chimney and a door that looks like it might give, remember this version. Remember that a home is not a stage for your curiosity. Remember that the forest keeps its own laws. And remember the last thing the old woman ever said. A small sound swallowed by the crackle of fire. No, if you enjoyed being unsettled by this darker telling, please like the video, subscribe, leave a comment with the story you want twisted next, and tell me what detail got under your skin the most. Was it the way the house kept its ritual? Was it the silence of the bears? Was it the idea that the cheerful version was never meant to be true? And if you are listening late and you find yourself getting up to check the lock, do it. There is no shame in it. Stories are only stories until the moment they are not. Because somewhere in the woods that does not appear on maps, there is still a cottage where porridge cools on a table. And if the door opens for you, it is not an invitation. Good night.
Whispers of a love so true, painting dreams of me and you. and I'll hold you close in this moment